Imagine a place where the cold is constant, yet heated debates simmer just beneath the surface. Norway, a country often associated with majestic fjords, the northern lights, and enviable quality of life, is also home to one of the modern world's most intriguing and controversial discussions: prostitution. Behind the breathtaking landscapes lies a complex story interwoven with public policy, morality, and the eternal tension between individual freedom and collective responsibility. To understand prostitution in Norway, we need to rewind to 2009. That was the year the country adopted what is known as the Nordic model. Under this approach, purchasing sexual services was criminalized, while selling them remained legal. A curious, almost paradoxical logic, deeply rooted in a specific vision of society, punishing those who create the demand while protecting those exploited by it. It sounds straightforward, but as with all matters involving human behavior, the reality is far more nuanced. The theory behind the Nordic model is fascinating. Imagine a spider web. The buyer of sexual services is seen as the center of that web, the starting point of the entire system of prostitution. The idea is that by cutting the threads connecting the buyer to the rest, the web collapses entirely. But what happens when the spiders learn to rebuild their webs in even more ingenious ways? Some argue that the Nordic model is progressive, placing responsibility on those who perpetuate the system rather than stigmatizing those oppressed by it. Others contend that this policy drives prostitution further underground, making it more dangerous for those already in vulnerable situations. This is where statistics come into play, but the story they tell depends heavily on who's interpreting them. Official figures suggest that the number of sex buyers in Norway has decreased since the law's implementation. To some, this is an undeniable victory. To others, it's merely the tip of the iceberg. Advocates for sex workers' rights argue that while prostitution may have become less visible, it hasn't disappeared. On the contrary, they claim that prostitution networks have grown more clandestine, making it harder to provide assistance and increasing the risks for those involved. And so, the central question arises: what is the cost of invisibility? When something is no longer seen, does it cease to exist? Social science teaches us that answers to such questions are rarely black and white. In Norway's pursuit of justice and equality, the country finds itself at a moral crossroads. In trying to eradicate prostitution, does it risk ignoring the individual stories of resilience, choice, and survival? Behind every statistic, there's a person. A woman, perhaps, who left her homeland seeking a better life, only to face a harsh and unexpected reality. A man quietly judged at every turn as he struggles to support his family in ways he never imagined. Or someone who deliberately and consciously chose sex work as their path, challenging stereotypes and societal expectations. Sociology urges us to look beyond the surface, to ask why certain choices are made and how social structures shape those decisions. In the case of prostitution in Norway, the answers are as diverse as the individuals involved. Some reports highlight the legislation's positive impacts, showing fewer people entering the sex market. Others, however, point to increased vulnerability among sex workers, who now have less access to healthcare and support due to fear of exposure or indirect criminalization. Norwegian culture, with its strong sense of equality and justice, plays a unique role in this scenario. Norway is often viewed as a bastion of progress, but even bastions have their flaws. The debate about prostitution isn't just a question of public policy, it's also a reflection of societal values. To what extent should individual freedom be sacrificed for the collective good? And who gets to define what the collective good is? A local study revealed an interesting tension. While many Norwegians support the criminalization of buying sex in theory, there's growing discomfort with the practical consequences of this approach. This discomfort underscores a fundamental truth about human nature. We want justice, but we also want compassion. And sometimes, those two forces collide. Interestingly, Norway isn't alone in this journey. Other Nordic countries, like Sweden and Iceland, have adopted similar legislation with varying results. Comparisons between these nations reveal fascinating nuances. For example, while Sweden is often cited as a success story, critics argue that its numbers also obscure darker realities. In Iceland, meanwhile, the debate appears less polarized, perhaps reflecting subtle cultural differences. And then there's the economic aspect, because, as they say, everything ultimately comes down to money. Prostitution is, at its core, an economic transaction. But what happens when economics meets morality? In Norway, the answer is complicated. Criminalizing the purchase of sex hasn't eliminated demand, but has instead changed its forms. The rise of digital platforms and the migration of prostitution to online spaces have created new challenges for regulators and human rights advocates. At the same time, there are stories that transcend statistics and political debates. Stories of solidarity, such as community organizations offering support to sex workers regardless of their circumstances. Stories of transformation, where individuals found new opportunities and rebuilt their lives. And stories of resistance, of people defying stigmas and reclaiming their humanity in a system that often reduces them to simplistic labels. Ultimately, prostitution in Norway is a microcosm of much larger issues: power, gender, inequality, and the nature of human choices. It's a topic that forces us to confront our own beliefs and prejudices, to ask not just what is right or wrong, but what is fair and humane. So, what can we learn from Norway? Perhaps above all, that there are no easy solutions to complex problems. Progress often involves trial and error, steps forward and back. And in a world as diverse as ours, empathy may be the most powerful tool of all. As the snow continues to fall silently over Norway's fjords, the debate about prostitution persists, like a flame that refuses to die out. And perhaps that's how it should be, because some questions don't exist to be resolved. They exist to remind us of our shared humanity.